Welcome back, everyone. So for this lecture, we're going to move topics slightly to sort of a transitionary topic between morphology and what we'll cover in the next unit on syntax. So we're still looking at words, and we'll be focusing on word classes, and specifically the word classes that you find in English. Each language will have slightly different ways of setting up word classes. But this will not only link to what we've talked about in morphology so far, but it'll also prepare us for how we start looking at how we put those words together into units in the syntax unit. So this will sort of transition us between morphology and into syntax, which we will start covering in the next unit. So when we think about words and word classes, a word is one or more morphemes that can stand on its own as a linguistic unit. So we've seen lots of examples of words, and we've seen some examples of how words are very different from language to language. So in English, a lot of our words are just roots that can be free, and we don't have to add other morphemes to them. So it can be as small as something as a, as in a book. Or it can be very large if we do add lots of morphemes and make something like anti-disestablishmentarianism, or as we saw in languages like Yupik, where words are conveying lots of complex thoughts. There's many morphemes together, and we would need a full sentence in English to convey that, but it is just one single word in that kind of language. You'll also hear words referred to as lexemes and part of our mental lexicon. And so this is something that would be sort of like the dictionary in your head. Like, what are the pieces that you keep in your mind as you're starting to put things together? And what we'll be looking at when we are starting to put words together and think about what relationships words have with each other, what similarities they have, we'll be looking at word classes. And so this is a set of words that share morphological and syntactic behavior. This is why this is sort of a link between the two different areas. And you may have heard them growing up as parts of speech. We use them as word classes to describe things in linguistics because of the behaviors that they have, rather than some of the descriptions that you may have had in classes growing up. And so these include things that hopefully you're somewhat familiar with, things like nouns, verbs, prepositions, determiners. And we typically divide these into what they're doing and how they're related. And these are typically divided into two main groups. There's either open classes of words or there are closed classes of words. And we'll look through the distinction between that. And so when we're looking at open versus closed classes, an open class of words is something that allows new lexemes to come into that class. So in English, things like nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs are all open class words. It's very easy for us to add a noun or add a verb or change something from a noun to a verb, or to come up with new adjectives. When we create slang, we're constantly adding new adjectives and adverbs. And these are words that we can also more easily borrow into a language. So we can find out a concept from another language, like moose, for instance, and we can easily borrow that into the language when it's an open class of words. A closed class, on the other hand, tends to resist new lexemes. And this isn't to say that they can't add them or they can't change. It just tends not to happen as frequently, and it tends to happen much more slowly over time than how quickly you can add words into an open class. So adding and changing closed class words is actually very difficult to do. And we can look at an example of our pronoun system in English and compare what we found in Old English from 1200 plus years ago to what we see in modern English. And you can see that our pronouns are actually still very similar. They sound a little different. We pronounce them differently because of some other sound changes that have taken place. But the system itself looks very similar. So ich to I, we to we, me to me, he to he, him to him. So most of them are actually still identical or similar to each other, and you can kind of see the historical relationship between them. And this is because these are words that we use frequently that are likely to be native to a language. And once we already have a system, there's not really a need to change the system unless some other social factor comes into play. So you'll notice you isn't on here, and that's because that did undergo change, going from things like thee and thou and thy to you becoming you, because of other social things that were taking place in the language. But most of our pronouns haven't changed and likely won't change from that system. And the other way that we can sort of describe these is not just by if they allow new words or if they resist new words, but also what they're doing in a sentence. So these can also be separated into what's known as content or function words. So open class words we often call lexical or content words, and this is because they have some sort of referent typically. They're easier to write a dictionary definition of, to draw a picture of, to point out in the world. They're things that you can describe a little bit more easily. So if I ask you to describe a cat or draw a picture of a cat or give a definition of a cat, it's pretty easy to describe that to a 3-year-old or have that be sort of explained pretty easily. Closed class words tend not to do the same kind of thing. They tend to function as grammatical words, and so we consider them function words or grammatical words instead, because what they're doing in a sentence is more about the relationship between the lexical words and not about their own definition. So these are really hard to define in a sort of dictionary definition, and you can't really draw a picture of the. Trying to explain what the word the means to a 3-year-old can be a little bit more difficult because it doesn't have that same kind of referent, it doesn't have that same kind of ease of definition. So when we're looking through word classes and we're trying to describe, well, how is it that we know something is a word class? This is where we start linking morphology and syntax together. And so we're using morphological evidence and syntactic evidence as our knowledge of what word class something belongs to. And so when we're doing this, this is going to be different than what you may have learned in grade school or what you may be used to if you're trying to teach parts of speech to children in most classes. We're not using semantic evidence. So in this area, when we're trying to define if something belongs to a specific word class, you don't use semantic evidence for this. So for example, in English, red, tall, fun, happy are all adjectives. They describe things. But they describe things as a semantic definition, and it has to do with the meaning of the words and not the structure of the words. And in a lot of languages, words that describe things are actually verbs. So you would have a verb to be red or to be fun, and they're not actually using adjectives to do so. So we want to use the structural evidence of that specific language to describe and define what things go with what. We can also use things like morphology. So we know that we can only add ER and EST endings to adjectives, redder, reddest. They give us a comparative or a superlative. I can't add those to any different word class and have the same kind of meaning because they can only go on adjectives. So the kinds of morphology that you see on words that have morphemes can give you evidence for what word class something is supposed to be as well. And then things like syntactic evidence, which we'll talk more about in the next unit, are things like knowing that in English, adjectives go before a noun. So the red car is something that we would have as a structure in English. So since an adjective will directly precede a noun, if you see it right in front of a noun, then chances are you have an adjective. You have a piece of syntactic evidence to tell you that. So this is the kind of evidence that we're going to be looking for. So you need context, you need information about the word besides just isolation in order to truly know. So if I say in English, is run a noun or a verb? You can't really tell in isolation because it could function as either a noun or as a verb. So you need things like morphology, or you need the context of the syntax as the evidence to know for sure. So if I say the dog is running through the park, then I would know, well, in this case, run must be a verb. And the reasons are that we know that an ing ending is something that I can only add to a verb. Is verbing is a common construction. I can only add ing to verbs. We also know in English that all verbs have to have a subject. We can't have a sentence that doesn't have a subject with the verb in English. So if I say that dog is running, then I have a subject, that dog. And I can say that that dog is a subject to the verb. But if I use the example, she went for a run, in this case, run is going to be a noun, and I have evidence for that. So I know that our article, can only come in front of nouns in English. This is a common thing that happens, but things like a or the are only things that can go with nouns. And then things like for, in our preposition for a run, will always have a noun phrase that goes after it. Prepositions will always come next to a noun phrase. And in that case, I have for a run. And so that has to be a noun phrase, so there has to be a noun in there. So I have structural evidence that can tell me that that's a noun in that case. We can also use different kinds of morphemes to determine the kinds of change that are happening. So derivational morphemes will go on specific word classes and they'll create new ones. And sometimes they create the same one, and sometimes they create something different. So adding ness to a word in English will always turn an adjective into a noun. So if I have happy as an adjective, I add ness, happiness. Now I have a noun. And that's always going to be the case. So if you see that ending, you know that the word you had before was an adjective, and you know that the word that you're going to have will be a noun. An AL ending turns nouns into adjectives, so nation is a noun, national is an adjective. Or ER turns verbs into nouns. So if I go from talk to talker, cheat to cheater, by adding that, I'm turning a verb into a noun. So derivational ones can give me information on the changes that are happening. And then inflectional ones will also only go on specific word classes. So the ones that we've looked at already, our S, our plural, can only go on nouns to tell us there's more than one. Our ing can only go on verbs to say that it's currently happening. Our ER and EST that go on adjectives can only go on adjectives, and it tells us that there's more or the most of something. So that's the kind of things that we'll be pulling from as we look for what words go into particular word classes. So with that, we'll look at all of the word classes in English, and we'll focus just on English word classes since they are different from language to language. And when we get to syntax, we'll be focusing on the structures of English. So we have several open class words. We have nouns, and then we have pronouns that replace nouns. We have verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. And then we have our closed classes. We have determiners, which is a broad class that includes things like articles, demonstratives, possessives, and quantifiers. We have prepositions, which is actually its own marker, conjunctions, and interjections. So we'll start with the open classes, and then we'll talk about the closed classes. And I'll give you some examples and some pieces of information that are used to determine what we have. So start with nouns, and I ask you, well, what's a noun? Chances are you're going to say a person, place, or thing, or a person, place, thing, or idea. And this is not going to be a definition that we can use. This is maybe one that you grew up with or that you got in grade school. But we need instead to talk about evidence. So what is the evidence we have for nouns? Nouns will always agree in gender, number, and case. So things like plural markers. So cat versus cats. I have to have that agreement if I'm talking about more than one cat. Case would be things like subject versus object. So our pronouns still show that in English. So he is a subject pronoun, him is an object pronoun. Or nouns can be the head of a noun phrase. So whatever you're talking about in a noun phrase, the noun is the main part of that. So in the big fluffy cat, all of that is helping you talk about cat. So that would be the main part of that phrase, and cat would be a noun. Nouns can also be the subject or an object of a verb, or it can be the object of a preposition. And you need to be specific when you're describing them. You can't just say, oh, it comes next to a verb, because lots of different words can come next to a verb. You need to talk about the relationship between them. So the cat ate the mouse. The cat is the subject of the word ate. The mouse is the object of that. And then where did this happen? On the porch. So anytime you have a preposition, you'll always have a noun phrase with it, and that would be the object of that preposition. And then with pronouns, we use pronouns to replace entire noun phrases. So even though pronouns themselves are a closed class, we don't really change them up very much. They are used to replace open class words. And this is helpful so that we don't have to keep repeating the same noun over and over, right? So we don't have to say someone's name every single time, or we don't have to say the entire title of something we're talking about every single time. So we have lots of them. We have subject pronouns like I and me. We have object pronouns like us. We have possessive ones like mine and ours. And then a lot of those other words that we use frequently without even really thinking about them as pronouns, this, that, are WH words, who, what, where, when, which, are all examples of pronouns because they're replacing a noun phrase in a sentence. So if I say, compare Joe saw the house and he saw it. So Joe saw the house, fine sentence. He saw it, also works. In this case, he is replacing Joe. And then it has to replace the house. You have to take the entire noun phrase to replace it. I can't say he saw the it and still be talking about the house. I have to take the entire phrase to replace it. And when we create questions, those WH words are also pronouns because they're replacing whatever would be in that sentence. We just don't necessarily know what would be there. So if I say, who saw the house? Who is replacing Joe? I just don't know what the answer to that is. I don't know it's Joe that's being replaced. Or what did Joe see? What is replacing the house? But I'm asking because I don't know what would go into that place instead. The one other aspect of nouns that's a little bit different is that there are mass and count nouns. So mass nouns are nouns that cannot have a number in front of them. So they act a little bit differently than most nouns. They cannot take plural markings because they aren't countable. So I can say I want some rice, and that's fine because I'm using some sort of way to quantify that differently. I can say I want 3 grains of rice, and I can put the plural on the grains. But I can't just say, I want rices, or I want 3 rice. I can't use those counting things where I have a plural or where I have a number, because that doesn't apply for a mass noun. So some of the common ones that we use are things like water, silverware, money, wood, flour, as in what you use for baking. You can have a cup of flour, but you don't have 2 flours when you're talking about baking. Count numbers, however, do have to take those number markers and those plurals. So if I say, I want a cat, fine, I'm talking about a single cat. Or I can say, I want cats, and then I have to add that plural. And then even if I'm adding additional pieces to quantify it, so I want 3 cats, I still have to have the plural. I want 3 baskets of cats. I still have to have the plural, even if I already have the plural. It also has to agree in that grammatical fashion. So those are nouns. The next one are verbs. And when I say, what is a verb? Chances are you're probably thinking to yourself, well, a verb is an action word. But again, this is not going to help us because that's a semantic definition. And this is even more problematic than using the definition of nouns because a lot of times verbs aren't actually action words. Many of our most common verbs don't describe actions. But they are used to agree in person, number, tense, aspect, and mood. So aspect and mood we often think of them as kinds of tense. It gives you information about when and how something is taking place. And there's 3 different kinds of verb constructions that we have. We can have intransitive verbs that will take a subject but don't take an object. So a word like, or sentence like, I eat, she slept, we are walking, are all perfectly fine sentences. These are intransitive verbs. Sometimes a verb has to be intransitive. It cannot take an object. So if I say she slept, I can't put an object. You can't sleep something. You just sleep. But a transitive verb will have a subject and an object. So I wrote a paper, or he eats apples. And you'll notice that in English, we can have a lot of our verbs that can be intransitive, where we don't have to have an object. But if it does have an object, then it's transitive. So a word like eat, I can say, I ate, and that's fine. I don't have to have what I ate in that sentence. But I can say, he eats apples, and I can have an object there, and it would still be grammatical. And then finally, we have ditransitive verbs. And these ones are pretty rare. There's not a lot of them, but they can be pretty common. And these will have a subject, and then they will have 2 objects, a direct and an indirect object. And the way that these ones work is you need both of those objects for it to make grammatical sense. So if I say, she gave me $1, I have to have both of those pieces. I can't just say she gave me. Well, what did she give me? I need to know that. Or she gave $1. Well, who got the dollar? I need to know who received the dollar as well. So I need both of those pieces for it to be grammatical. And so this is something that doesn't happen often, but words like gave or give are good examples in many languages of the kind of word that would need both of those objects to be present. We also have cases where you have verbs that absolutely do not convey action but are still important. So copula verbs are verbs that we use very frequently but aren't actually describing an action. These are sometimes known as linking verbs, where we're tying 2 concepts together. And so typically what you have is you have a subject, and then on the other side you have some other noun, adjective, or some sort of prepositional phrase. But there isn't another verb there. There's not an action verb of any kind. It's sort of a link between the subject being equal to in some way to whatever is in the predicate. And the most common form of copula verb are to be words. So this is something that we see in many other languages as well. But if I say Alex was a plumber, it links Alex to being a plumber. Alex equals plumber. This slide is blue. The slide equals blue. I will be at home in this afternoon. I equal at home. So you have this sort of link between what's before and what's after. And it's just that form of to be that's the only verb, the main verb in the sentence, but it's not conveying an action. I'm not doing anything. It's giving me more of a state of being or some sort of state that's describing whatever that subject is. And then we also have a few other kinds of verbs that are more unique to certain kinds of languages. So Germanic languages often will use what are known as phrasal verbs. And we have a lot of these in English as well, where a verb is one single concept, but isn't just a single lexeme. And so we call these phrasal verbs, or you may have heard verbs with the verb particle. And these are verbs that you need both pieces or multiple pieces in order for it to make sense as that individual meaning. So things like make up, make out, go out, give in, give up, work out, mean something different than the first verb by itself would mean if you had some sort of preposition. So we have a difference between Pat and Alex are going out or Pat and Alex are going out. Where the first one is talking about, well, they're dating, they're together. The second one is talking about going out to see a movie. It's just about the motion itself. And one way you can test these out is that you can't separate phrasal verbs because they act as a single unit. So I can say she made a check out to her landlord. And so what you're doing is you're talking about writing a check, and you can separate that because out is being used as a preposition. But I can't move that around for the interpretation of she made out with her partner, because in that case, made out or made out with is something that functions as a single unit, and you can't move those words around and still get the same meaning. Finally, we also have what are known as auxiliary verbs or helping verbs. And these ones we classify separate, so when we start getting into syntax and we're drawing out these, auxiliary verbs are labeled differently because they function differently than a main verb. And these are known as helping verbs because they're usually alongside a main verb in a clause, and they, in English, occur before the main verb of a clause. So these are to be words, things from to have or to do, things like should, would, could, are modals, are examples of these kinds of helping verbs. So they can look similar to those copula verbs, but there will also be a main verb in the sentence. So he should eat something after practice. Eat is the main verb, and should is giving me additional information. It's contextualizing it. It's helping that verb. So that one would be our auxiliary. Or I am waiting for the bus right now. We have one of those to be verbs, but it's not explaining who I am. I doesn't equal waiting. It's saying I am waiting. It's giving me that helping part to show that I'm going to talk about the progressive. It's currently happening. Or when we use our future concept, we use things like these auxiliary verbs. So they will lead discussion next week. The will is helping out the main verb lead to give you a sense of time. We also can use these for things like emphasis. So I did my homework versus I did do my homework, where you add one of these auxiliaries in front of a main verb to sort of emphasize it. And we can also use these to create questions. So you did your homework versus did you do your homework? We use one of these auxiliary verbs to move it around and create a question structure in English as well. So those are verbs. Most of the others that we have are going to be relatively quick to go through. Nouns and verbs are the most complicated by far. Adjectives are the next one. And adjectives are lexical words. They're never grammatically required. And depending on the language, they may be open or closed class. So in English, these are open class. We can add and change adjectives very easily. And typically, they're a complement to a copula. So they're going to show up after a copula verb in the object position. Or they can modify a noun phrase directly where they're directly in front of a noun. And English speakers have a preference for some adjective orders or over others, where we've started to discover that typically the more salient parts are closer to the noun. And a common order that has been researched is that you would say something like an opinion, then size, then age, then shape, then color, then origin, then material, then purpose, then the noun. So even though we can just put a bunch of adjectives in front of a noun, we still have a preference for where we put things. So if I am talking about the big red mylar balloon, This works perfectly fine with our system. This sounds like a way I would describe a balloon. But if I said the Mylar red big balloon, it just sounds weird as an English speaker because those adjectives aren't in the preferred ordering. There's also a special kind of adjective that we'll talk about with determiners as well, and these are numerals. Numerals can only specify count nouns, so they're very unique in what they can do. So 3 cats, a billion stars, 0 pieces of pizza. And these are technically a closed class, even though they conceptually go on to infinity, because there's still a very small amount of words that we're using. So as we're talking about larger and larger numbers, we're just reusing a very small set of numbers. And it's very hard to change that number system. We don't really add or change any of our numbers that we're using frequently. But numerals can function in a sort of interesting way where they can be a determiner. So if I have 3 books, I could write either determiner or adjective, and we'll talk about determiners in a moment. Or I can use it as an adjective and say the 3 books and have a determiner there already, and then also use 3 as an adjective. And so numerals are the only kind of determiner that can also be an adjective. They sort of function uniquely that way. Related to adjectives are adverbs. So adverbs are similar to adjectives in that they're always lexical, they're never grammatically required, and they can also be open or closed class depending on the language. Not all languages really have adverbs in the way that we think about them. We have them as an open class. We can make new adverbs very easily. And typically in English, these will modify verbs or adjectives. They can have a flexible word order, and adverbs are unique in this. They're the only word class that has a very flexible word order where we can put them in different places in a sentence and not change the meaning of the sentence. Often they end in an ly, but this isn't always the case. So if I say, then she ran swiftly across the finish line, this works, but I can move swiftly around. So I could say, swiftly she ran across the finish line, or she ran across the finish line swiftly. And in each of those cases, we still know it's telling me something about the verb, and I can move it around in the sentence. Most word classes can't be moved, and when we get to syntax, we'll see how rigid that is. Because if we move it, then it changes the meaning of the sentence. And adverbs are special in that they don't do that. So those are our open classes in English. And then for our closed classes, we start with determiners, which are a closed class. They're grammatical words that specify a noun, so they'll always go inside a noun phrase. And we have a lot of different kinds of determiners: articles, demonstratives, possessives, quantifiers, sometimes numerals. But we list them all under this label determiner. So we're not going to describe the as an article when we're putting them into a sentence, because they all fall under this class of determiner, because only one of these can be in a noun phrase in English at any given time. So I can say the book, or I can say my book, and that's fine. But I can't say the my book. I can't put 2 of them. So even if I have a possessive and an article, these are all fitting into the same spot of determiner. So we only use determiner to describe these. So we look at articles briefly. In English, we have articles the, a, and an. And really, we just have 2. We have the as our definite article and a or an as indefinite, where a and an are actually allomorphs of the same morpheme. So they change based on if they're next to a vowel sound or if they're next to a consonant sound. So they have a variation from that. In some languages, these also agree in gender and number with things like nouns and things like adjectives. So in Spanish, they have a much broader set of articles that give you information about if it's definite or indefinite, but also if it's masculine or feminine, if it's singular or plural, etc. And then some languages like Russian just don't have articles at all. With demonstratives, these are also a type of determiner, and this picks out an item that's either close to or far away from the speaker. So these are things like this and that, these and those. So I can have this cat or these dogs, that book, those apples. Some languages will have 3 demonstrative levels. So in Japanese, you can have kono, this that's next to me, sono, that that's next to you, or ano, that one that's over there. So you have a different relationship based on what's next to you, what's next to the person you're talking to, or if something is further away from both of you. And these can also be used as pronouns if they replace an entire noun phrase. So I want these apples versus I want these. Japanese will change the forms to do the same kind of thing. in English, our demonstratives, we use the same form as pronouns or as determiners. For our possessives, possessives are going to mark ownership of a noun. And these are things like my, your, his, her. And so this is my favorite book. Their apartment is messy. Were examples of these. But we also have another one where if we mark a noun with our possessive morpheme, our apostrophe S, it's no longer functioning as a noun. It's instead functioning as a determiner. So if I say John's book is on the desk, John itself is a noun. But when I say John's book, John's with the apostrophe S is no longer functioning as a noun. It's now acting as a determiner, as a possessive, and then book would be the main noun. We also have possessive pronouns that can replace these, and we have different ones in English. So mine, yours, his, hers are the replacements for an entire noun phrase. So rather than saying, this is my favorite book, I can say, this is mine, and replace the entire noun phrase with one of those. And then lastly, quantifiers are a broad way to mark the quantity of any noun. So this is something that can work with mass nouns, some water, a little rice, a great deal of sand, or with count nouns, few trees, many apples, a couple cats. And there's some that can apply to both mass or count nouns and others that can't. So I would never be able to use few really as a mass with a mass noun. I can't have few pizza, but I could say few trees. And some work with both. So some lettuce or some figs, lots of flour, lots of cookies, plenty of cheese, plenty of burritos. So some of them can work either way, and some of them prefer either mass or count nouns. For prepositions, these are across languages known as adpositions because they can sometimes be in front of something and sometimes be after. We call them prepositions because we typically put them in front of the noun phrase that they're going with. So it's a closed case that gives a relationship, typically a position of a noun phrase that it's with, to something else in a sentence. So either a verb phrase or a noun phrase. So growing up, you may have heard that prepositions are anything an airplane can do to a cloud. And this is one way of thinking about it, but that would only be linking a noun phrase to a noun phrase. This can also be something that can go with a verb phrase. So in English, we can have them with a noun phrase or with a verb phrase. So in a link between a noun phrase and a noun phrase, the man in the yellow coat. The yellow coat is linking to that preposition, so it's in it, that noun phrase, but it's linking to the noun in front of it, the man. So it's telling me something about the man. But if I say he rode on a black horse is giving me information about how the riding took place. It's telling me about that verb. So these can go either with a noun phrase or with a verb phrase. We also have conjunctions. And if you think about Schoolhouse Rock, I often play that, but for YouTube posted videos, there's copyright issues. So if you want to go look up conjunction junction and get that in your head, you're more than welcome to. But conjunctions join two constituents together. So in conjunction junction, they say, words or phrases or clauses, which is true, but it has to be something that functions as a unit. And so you can have, I want to eat some salad and go for a run. It's linking two constituents, two groups of words, where a constituent is something we'll talk about more with syntax, but it's any sort of thing that sort of functions as a unit together. So if you think about affixes going onto a root of a word and creating a full word, constituents are the same kind of thing, where you might have multiple words that are sort of acting together as one big unit in the same kind of way. And importantly, conjunctions can only join things that are equal in structure. So a noun can go with a noun. A verb phrase can go with a verb phrase. So I can say you can eat either peas or carrots, and that's fine. But I can't say you can eat either peas or go home, because it's linking peas and go home together, and those aren't the same. So that one would be marked as incorrect, something we can't actually do. But I can change up the wording of this, get rid of that either, and say you can eat peas or go home. And now this works again because I'm linking two things that are the same kind of structure. So our common ones are things like but, nor, when, if, because, then, and then and or. And I can link things as big as two full clauses. So I can say I will buy a new car if I get this job. These are two independent clauses that are sentences, but I'm linking them together with a conjunction. Or I like pretzels because they are salty. So you can link anything, any kind of structure at any level. The last one we'll talk about is interjections, and these ones work differently than all of the others that we've talked about. All of the other word classes are things that go into the structure of a sentence itself. Interjections, however, tend to function at a discourse level, at a conversational level. They're not part of the grammar of the sentence. They're never required grammatically to be there. But we add them to convey some sort of function, some sort of thing like a discourse marker. So, yeah, We have greetings and other conventions, so things like hello or cheers or oops. Attention getters like excuse me or psst. And then different sort of exclamations and expletives. And when we write these, they're typically written with some sort of punctuation to show that they're separate from the meaning of whatever that sentence is. So they function not as something grammatical, but as something conversational that we use when we're talking about things. So in our class that we have together, when we're in synchronous class, we'll have practice chances and we'll be talking about how to apply this, how to think about this with examples. But in the meantime, if you do have questions, shoot me an email, send an office hours appointment my way, or save the questions for when we're in Zoom class together, and we'll be able to talk about them.